Welcome to Recollections, the Middle Tennessee Voices of Their Time series. A look at the past through the experiences of Middle Tennesseans. I'm Bob Bullen of Middle Tennessee State University, along with my guest, Mr. Clyde Rees of Shelbyville, Tennessee. Mr. Rees is a World War II veteran who had the opportunity to participate in one of the most significant events of modern warfare, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Mr. Rees was a member of the 20th Air Force and the 3rd Photo Squadron. He was a member of a unique photograph group that worked from a specially equipped B-29 and photographed the bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Mr. Rees, that was really a momentous occasion for world history. At the time, did you realize that was going to be such a significant event?
No, we had no idea when we went on those missions as to what it was or what the result would be. In fact, no one seemed to have ever heard of an atomic bomb. Certainly, I guess it was one of the most kept secrets. There's usually rumors that get around things going on. In this event, there was no leak, to my knowledge, of anything whatsoever ahead of time. In fact, we thought we was on a regular run. And even after we saw the results, we still didn't know what was going on until after we got back. And then we were told what had happened. Even after we were told that the bomb had been dropped, we still didn't really know the significance of what it was all about.
So they were really training you just to play your role, and you didn't know the other parts of the puzzle, did you?
No, that is correct. We did not. We were just doing our normal. Our squadron was set up to do the photo recon both before and after bomb runs. And of course, this atomic bomb was put in there along towards the last, just a result of what was going on there. But at the time, we didn't know anything different than it was a normal bomb run.
Well, we're making this filming in 1988, and people are still writing about the dropping of those bombs. Do you think that was necessary? Should we have done that?
At the time, and sometime after it, I questioned it very much because it looked like we had Japan pretty well whipped. But in retrospect, looking back over everything, I think it definitely was worthwhile. I think it's shortened the war. In my opinion, we would have had to invaded Japan had it not been for that. And I think we saved countless lives, both Japan and the U.S., by dropping the bomb. And something like that is probably inevitable anyway. And during the war, we got a chance to see the results. And all this time has passed, and so far we've not had to use another one. And if they had not been dropped, somebody might have turned one loose and after the war was over, and much more devastating results.
The Japanese certainly felt the effects of the radiation years later, and we've had some of our troops who witnessed droppings of the bombs in a test situation in the deserts in this country to have after effects from radiation. What about your group, radiation? I
have had no contact with anybody in my group that has had any effect from the radiation from these runs. I could not say that there wasn't some. I lost contact with all of my people pretty soon after the war. I certainly don't feel that I've had any effect from it, and we were right there, right above it. We definitely had radiation, there was no doubt about that, but I don't see that I've had any after effects from it.
Now, you were a flight engineer on a B-29. I guess you could say that it was almost by luck that your group was selected and worked into the situation.
Well, it was the way we had, I believe, about 30 flight crews in our squadron, and more or less you took your flight turn by rotation. There was nothing particularly special about my crew. It was just our turn to make the flight in rotation with other with the other flight crews. They tried to keep every crew with about the same number of missions. And I don't think anybody was picked out special one way or other to either avoid what we'd call a dangerous mission or go into an easy one.
We'll talk a little bit more in detail about the B-29 after a while, but before we go too far, let's just mention how many people were in a flight crew and what did a flight engineer do?
The flight crew on our planes consisted of 11 men, and I think that was true on all of the B-29s in operation over there. We had an airplane commander or pilot in command, a co-pilot, flight engineer, a radio operator, and a navigator, and normally a bombardier. Now in my squadron, we didn't call him a bombardier because we didn't drop bombs. We had what we call a photo navigator. His job was to take over and direct the airplane over the targets, quite similar to what a bombardier would have done. But he is specially trained to make these photo runs. The rest of the men on board were gunners, and making a total of 11. There was 5 officers and 6 enlisted men on board the airplane.
I think that people would like to know how you got involved in this and go back through your early history. So let's just start in the beginning. You're from Flat Creek area?
Flat Creek area. I was born and raised Flat Creek, got what little education I got at Flat Creek. I completed 2 years of high school at the old Flat Creek School, and then I had to go to Shelbyville then to complete my last 2 years. I graduated in 1939. Of course, times were still pretty rough in 1939. There wasn't much going on. I was born and raised on the farm, and I decided a long time that I wanted something a little bit better or different, to say the least of it. So I left home and went to Memphis and studied diesel engineering, or diesel mechanic, I guess you'd say. Worked on the Mississippi River as a flunky on a tugboat, which had to do with the diesel engines. And that was in 1939, early part of 40.
Let me stop you on that just a minute.
Yeah.
That's an interesting point there. You found when you were in high school that you were really a math whiz, weren't you?
I was pretty good in math, if I do have to say so myself. That was my pride and joy, was math.
So that helped you when you went into the mechanical aspects of things?
Absolutely, yes, it definitely did.
Well, let's talk about working on a tugboat. That was rough work, and you took a trip to New Orleans that I'd like for you to describe.
We got on at Memphis on a tug. It was it. Well, actually, first deal, I replaced a man that either had sick or vacation, more or less temporarily. We went from Memphis to Cape Cairo, Illinois, and then turned around and went back to New Orleans and then back into Memphis. These tugs was rather interesting. They pushed the barges up and down. And I remember it from Memphis, it took us a week to get to New Orleans and 3 weeks to get back. Pushing the current coming back was, of course, quite a bit more time consuming, took a lot more power. One of the interesting things when we got back, this was in the winter of 1939, early part of 40. Going down, the weather was spring-like. Coming back, the bottom had strictly fell out of it. It dropped to way below zero and stayed that way for about 10 days there in Memphis. And when we was trying to get into the harbor, the ice flow was so great that we couldn't push our barges in by ourselves. We had to send another tug out to get us to push in. Now this ice flow was great enough, it went plumb out. It's seen 100 miles out in the Gulf, flown out of the Mississippi River.
Now you said going down that it was one of the driest years that you'd ever...
It was one of the driest years they'd had at that time, and the old mighty miss, as everybody knows about it, wasn't all that mighty then. Our tugs had to have 9-foot depth of water to float through, and the main channels going down, there was about 3 places we didn't have 9 foot of water, and the width of the river in those places was probably I'd say 500 yards across. Now then, coming back, it was a different story because the water had fell and the thing had spread out and on down into Louisiana. I'd hesitate to even guess as to how wide it was.
Some rough characters worked on tugboats.
Yes, they were. They were very rough characters, but one thing that I did observe, I was an old country boy and didn't know much about it, they were loyal characters. They'd soon slit your throat just to look at you if you was against them, but when you become a part of their crew, they'd slit somebody else's throat too to protect you. Didn't make any difference.
Well, as a country boy coming out of Flat Creek, you got your eyes full in New Orleans, too.
I got my eyes full. I saw things that if somebody told me about, I wouldn't have believed. And for the first night that I was in New Orleans, which I stayed on ship with a friend of mine, a young fellow sort of like myself. And one of the interesting things about this crew, every one of them to the man come around and asked me if I was going to stay on board. I told them I was. They come, well, hold this money for me. Here's $50. When I get back, I won't have anything, and if you'll hang on to it till I get back, then I'll have a little bit. And then the next night we was out, me and my buddy decided to wander around. Of course, wander around in the middle of the streets was all that I did. Frankly, I was scared to do anything else because I just didn't know what it was all about. But the situation was something else.
When you got back to Memphis, you still had to find a way to earn a living, and that led to enlistment in the Army Air Force?
Yes. When we got back, of course, my job on this tugboat was strictly temporary. I knew that when I hired on. The guy that took the place of come back to the job. And then there was a captain that had a yacht that brought out from the Great Lake region down there just to maintain. It was an old ship, but it was a luxurious at one time. And he was an old retired captain. So I got with him. I had a place to live on this boat, and occasionally we'd charter it out on a Sunday afternoon or someplace and make a little bit of money. That was slow and very little coming in. He was an alcoholic, and when he got enough money to get him whiskey, he didn't want to do anything else till he used all that up, and so we sat there. So then I started looking around to try to find something else to do.
Tell me about enlisting. I thought that was a good story.
Well, during this process of doing there, of course, I had a lot of time on my hands. There's nothing to do, and I was wandering around up on, I believe it's 1st Street there in Memphis, anyway, where the post office was. And I had no idea. Somebody had told me 30 minutes before I went in the recruiting office that I would even thought of such thing. I'd told, well, you're crazy. But I saw the sign, and there I was, and I walked in, just strictly for information. Now, of course, I was dealing with boats, so my first thought was Navy, and I walked into the Naval Recruiting Office, and I guess first thing I asked him before I got into anything else was how long a term have I got to sign up for? And he says, well, the enlistment is 6 years, period. And so I said, thank you, goodbye. I don't need none of that. I wasn't going to commit myself for no 6 years on some unknown. So on the way out, I saw the Air Force, or the U.S. Army Air Corps at the time. So there's a sign, mechanics, airplane mechanics wanted. Well, that was down my line too. So I went in there and asked him the same question. I said, what's the enlistment? 3 years. Okay, let's talk. That's a lot less than the Navy had. So really, before I hardly knew what I was doing, I guess, I had signed up for the Air Force.
Well, you ran and you got to go to some exciting places for your training. One of the places you went to was Yale. What do you remember about Yale University?
Well, Yale University, I knew nothing really. I didn't have any contact with the Yale people, that is the university people, except the physical training. The Air Force or Air Corps apparently had contracted with the Yale personnel for their physical people, physical training people, to do our training, and they did that. The buildings was very unique. I don't know the age of some of them. Looked like some of them might have been there from the year 1. One thing particular that I do remember was I've always been interested in electricity, and some of these oldest buildings, they had their own steam generating plant right within the facilities, and it was all direct current on those buildings. Now, in the meantime, the newer buildings and everything had been wired for the city power, which was alternating current. But when I was there, they were still using in these buildings the direct current for these old steam-operated generators.
Now, this was 1940?
1943, early part of 44, I believe.
When you went to Yale?
Yes.
So
right.
Before you went to Yale, you had some other experiences in Florida and Denver?
Yes, my original assignment when I enlisted was in Montgomery, Alabama, Gunner Field. And from there, I was transferred to Chanute Field, which was the only Air Force technical school at that time, and I was transferred to Chanute to go through airplane mechanic school, that was known. And I graduated from there. Well, the U.S., of course, saw that war was coming. Of course, we didn't know for sure. Nobody thought anything particular about it, but we were beginning to build up. And they saw that they was going to need more training schools. Now, the school at Chanute was in operation in World War I. It was an Air Corps training field in World War I. Some of the buildings, some of the facilities were still there. We used the mess hall, for instance, of left over from World War I when I was up there. And when I graduated then, they had decided they was going to start 2 more schools, and they took our entire graduating class to make instructors rather than going to be mechanics.
I like what you told me about finding out you were going to be an instructor. That's interesting.
Well, it was rather, it tore me all to pieces because I wanted to be a mechanic. I wanted to get down to grease and handle the wrenches. And in my opinion, there was no way that I could instruct anybody. I might answer a question if somebody answered me, but the thought of standing up before a group of people and instructing them was just as foreign as me being the king of Ethiopia or something like that. There's just no concept that I could do that. And I'd done about everything within my power to try to contacted everybody, including the chaplain, to try to get that assignment relieved. But as you'd know in the service, you don't get that done. When they put the thing down, that's it. Well, so I did get the assignment I wanted. I was told that we could take a choice of Keesler Field, Biloxi, Mississippi, or Wichita Falls, Texas, I believe. The other two schools that was being up, or I could stay at Chanute. Well, when you're in the service, the field that where you're stationed, that's the worst one in the country. The one you've just left is a good one. The one you're going to is a good one, but not the one where you are. So anything to get out of Chanute. Well, I don't know whether I was lucky or not, but I asked for Biloxi and got it, and was transferred down there. And it was about 3 or 4 months before the school actually got into operation down there.
Well, you tell me about that first day you went into the classroom.
Well, that's when I got resigned that I was going to be an instructor, and whether I could or not didn't matter. And I finally learned before we went in that there'd be an instructor, a chief instructor, and an assistant. Well, naturally, with no background or no training, I knew that I'd be the assistant. And I figured, well, fine, I'll learn. I can learn pretty fast. I get my assignment the first day, and I'm the chief instructor. So I go into class, I stare at 30 people back there, and I can't even pronounce their names or anything. I do well to spell their names, and about all I know to do is call the roll. And there I am standing there in front of that group with 8 hours to try to kill. And I learned 2 or 3 things right quick. I thought the instructor had to know all the answers, but within a day or two I found out the instructor does not have to know the answers. He just has to be very careful and not try to snow somebody under and make them think he does, because there's always one sitting in that classroom that's smarter than you are. And some of the people got in a sad trap on that by trying to bluff their way through. And my simple answer was, if I got a question to answer, if I knew it, I answered the best I could. If I didn't, I'm sorry, fellas, I don't know, but if you're interested, we'll find out.
So you learned quickly to get them involved in doing things rather than you just trying
Right.
to
That's one of the first things I learned, was to get them involved, and then I had it made. All I had to do was sort of direct them and keep things in order.
Well, the Air Force took a liking to you. They found out you were good at math, and the next thing you found out you were really trained to be a flight engineer, to be an officer.
Well, I guess one of the first things was, which really didn't have that much to do with the Air Force, it was more my doing, but I found out that there was an officer training opening in the mechanical part. And the fact that I had this, the background that I had in the mechanical and the mathematics, I was qualified to go for officers training. And they held out a carrot again there. 6 weeks I was supposed to get my commission on a short-term deal, because I'd been all through this school. I had been through the school, I had taught in the school, but as my luck would have it, I guess, when this class come through, they sent us to Boca Raton, Florida for basic training. That's the old drill and the nitty-gritty, nothing to do with any intelligence other than drill and do what they say do. That's all was there. That's 6 weeks. And then I was supposed to have had 2 more weeks just to brush up on the mechanical, but they decided they didn't want no more short-term officers, so they canceled that, and I had to go through the whole class. And that's when I was transferred up to Yale, and that's where that part was. Went back through the same thing that I had taught in and had graduated in just a year or 2 before.
You told me about one experience where they asked everybody if they could work the slide rule, and of course you'd never been exposed to that.
Well, after we graduated at Yale, we got our commission. Now, we was to be ground engineering officers when we graduated from Yale, strictly mechanical, strictly ground. The B-29 program now had come into effect. They had just gotten that thing. They knew it had come on the line, so they decided they needed a few people that specialized in the B-29. So my whole class, again, was sent to Boeing Aircraft Factory, still for ground operation, still just to learn the mechanics of that at the factory. So that was real nice. I was real interested in that and real proud of that. But now here we go again. 3 months of that, which was fine. Then they had determined that the flight engineers on the B-29 would be commissioned officers, not enlisted men. And this was a position that the Air Force had never had on an airplane before the flight engineer job was. So again, they take the whole class and send us to Denver for flight engineering training. And then when we come in the classroom and they tell us to start with, now of course I knew math, but the instructors told us that if you, with no computers, no calculators back then of course, slide rule was it. And the instructor told us that if you can't operate slide rules, you might as well go home. So I'd never seen a slide rule. I wasn't sure what the man was even talking about at that time. But I got me a slide rule, and I was good enough in math that I was able to keep up with some that had master's degrees and had their slide rule doing these problems. Some of these problems would take 4 hours, long math, to calculate the problem. Well, I'd calculate it the long method. I'd use my slide rule, but even when I graduated, I'd work one out on the slide rule, which I'd learned to use, but I always checked it for accuracy with the long method. So I was doing double duty on it.
So when you planned a flight, there was considerable amount of
a lot of work
preparation.
There's a lot of work in it. A general flight planning would take, at least in theory or at least in training. Now, we had a thing that was rather interesting. Of course, I was proud we went through it. When we got into actual flight, then they had a special slide rule that had only to do with this load and stuff in Recollections B-29. Now, and it took very little to learn how to operate that rule. And within 10 minutes, you could take that slide rule and calculate flight. But we had all this other background where we'd know what was going on.
Well, the B-29 is an interesting plane. It's called the Super Fortress, and I looked up some facts on that, and I believe that the plane weighed something like 60 tons, and it was on the drawing board as early as 1940, but the development of that plane was crucial to the war effort, but it also suffered some setbacks. And tell me what you know about the development of the plane and your involvement.
Yes, of course. I knew nothing of the plane until we was earmarked after we graduated and got our commission to go to the factory. But when we got to the factory, well, we found out quite a few things that we hadn't been made public. The first 2 planes that was built, one of them was built for static destruction or static tests. It never flew. It never intended to fly. The next one was built was fully instrumented, and it did fly. And they had, of course, they had their key engineers, and I forgot how many tons of instruments there was on it, but practically everything. They could read just about everything that happened on that airplane, from including the props bending and so forth. But that plane, unfortunately, the engines really were not adequate for this plane. They had a terrible overheating problem. They had to use what was available, and the engines didn't have hardly enough horsepower. The plane was designed more streamlined than any plane had ever been. The cowling and the nacelles, the engine winds was tightly baffled. And as a result, this plane caught fire and it crashed right downtown Seattle, right on the top of a packing plant. And I don't know how many people was killed in the packing plant, but quite a few, and it lost, I think it was 16 men on board, which was the chief engineers. It was the elite of Boeing that knew more about the B-29 than anybody else did. Total loss, plane, instruments, personnel, and it set the production back anyway, I guess, from 6 to 10 months, and at a crucial time when the plane was needed.
What was your involvement in terms of how a crew worked? Tell me how a B-29 crew worked. You mentioned 11, and you mentioned the different jobs in there. Describe the interior of a B-29 and tell me how the team worked together.
B-29, of course, was the first pressurized cabin, first pressurized airplane that was ever built. And there was 6 men up front in what we call the flight deck. Your nose man, which only had the plexiglass between him and the wide open spaces, was normally the bombardier, or in our case, photo navigator. And then your next 2 people on the left side of the plane was the airplane commander, and on the right side was the co-pilot. And then I sat right behind the co-pilot as a flight engineer, and I sat back to him. We sat back to back. I faced the rear of the plane. Then just a little bit further back was the radio operator. Then behind the behind the pilot, a little bit further back was the regular long-distance navigator. He had his desk and his instruments and all of his things there. Now, back in the back of the plane, you had 2 bomb bays, and a tunnel connected the front part of the airplane to the back part. The bomb bays were not pressurized. You went through this tunnel to get into we call it the gunnery compartment. And there was 3 men, I believe, back there in the main part, and then there was 1 tail gunner. And this plane was rather unique because all the machine guns on it were remote control. Nobody touched the gun as such. In fact, the crew couldn't even get to one of the guns. They had a system up I call central fire control. And you had 1 central fireman that he had a dome right in the middle at the back, and he could take, by throwing switches, he could take command of all the guns on that airplane. He could fire every gun on there. And the other gunners could fire any gun that they could see. In other words, if they could see the plane from their position, then the gun, if it could reach it from where it was. For instance, the tail gunner could only fire backwards. But the front man, or this central fire, could direct probably 3/4 of the guns on that plane to any one spot.
This was called a flying super fortress. As I said, it weighed 60 tons, but it had a non-stop flying of 16 hours. What about the altitude? How high?
Altitude, the highest we ever went, and this was absolutely the limit under the circumstances because we were attempting to see how high we could go, 38,000 feet. Our normal photo runs was at about 32 to 34 because our cameras were set up a fixed focus at that, and that gave us the altitude that we wanted to run over. So that's what we tried for.
All right, tell me a little bit about how your plane was especially designed for the photo reconnaissance.
These planes come off of the line, of course, at the factory at Boeing Aircraft strictly as bombers. And then they were sent, I believe, to Wichita Falls, Kansas for the modification. And there was special photo glass installed as these cabins was pressurized. And there was 3 places back in the crew compartment, back of the bomb bay, where these cameras was installed. And then there's special heavy, thick glass, optically clear to take a photograph through it. And these cameras was aimed through that. The center camera was about 7 foot tall and probably weighed about 110 or 15 pounds. And it was set in there to shoot straight down, and along with it there was one on each side shot as a shorter camera at about a 45-degree angle. And they would shoot together. Now we had a photographer on board that operated the camera, specialist in that. He was also a gunner if need be. But that was his job to get these things, the film loaded, and they were direct prints. I think the straight down one, I believe, would shoot a 12 by 18. A direct print. That's how big the film was and what they'd shoot. This was highly sensitive film for its day. Now, we had no infrared or anything like that. It was strictly just like the old box camera. You had to have the light. And as a result, of course, a lot of our missions was duds because we get up there and if it is totally clouded over, well, we didn't do any good. I'd say probably a third of our missions was no pictures.
You flew 20 missions over Japan, right?
I flew 20 missions over Japan itself, yes. Mm-hmm.
38,000 feet over the Pacific, that's a long way from Flat Creek. Well,
yeah, that's a long way up.
Well, what was your attitude about flying and fear of crashing or fear of death? How did the crew accept that? And what was your attitude?
Most of the crew accepted it, I think, is rather straightforward on that. My attitude when I first got over there, I'll never forget the reaction when I landed. Air Transport Command brought us over. We did not fly our planes over there. And it does happen that when we landed, the Corps of Engineers was doing some improvement on the runway, and about the time our plane hit the ground, they set off a charge of dynamite, and some of that coral sprinkled our airplane. And my reaction is, let's get out of here, and get out of here now. I've done seen all I want to. But as a result, we found out later what it was. Now, the first mission, I guess it's like most anything you get into. You're looking into the unknown, and I had this little adventure into me. I wasn't scared. Let's just go see what's out there. And I don't say that I was ever particularly scared on that mission, but after about, I guess the first one was around 14 to 15 hours, we saw nothing but the Pacific and then the Japan just for about a couple of minutes, maybe you'd say. And there the Pacific was again and nothing. And when I got back, I don't say that I was particularly scared, but I was resigned to the fact that there's no way that a human being can make these missions that we felt like we had to and survive. It just seemed an impossibility. Again, I wasn't really afraid of it, but it wasn't a matter of which one. I mean, it was a matter of which one I go down on. But we just figured that it'd be inevitable that we'd go down on one of them.
And we need to establish where you were based at this time and how far you were flying in terms of miles to Japan.
We were based to start with on Saipan. That was the first island that had the runways, and that's where the planes first came to. Tinian was only about a mile off of the shore of Saipan. Now the bombers operated out there. Well, as the bombers got over in higher numbers, then we were moved to Guam, which was about 125 miles further south. And the reason they moved us is because they wanted all the bombers just as close as they could, because it was a matter of fuel versus bombs. And to carry enough fuel to make the mission, they had to leave some bomb load off. Well, we weren't carrying bombs. We had plenty of fuel anyway. We had extra capacity. So they put us down there. And what we would do in addition to that, we would take off from Guam and fly to Saipan, though, and load up again with fuel. We'd take off actually from Saipan.
Now that was your job, about calculating distance and fuel
Yes.
consumption?
Yes, that was part of the flight engineer's job, was to calculate. If we had been in a bomb squadron, it would have really been more important than it was in my squadron, because what we did, we always filled to the gills. We didn't leave any space. So now what I did have to do, though, I had to account how far I can go if I lose an engine. How can I complete the mission? Because it's going to take more fuel with 3. Or if I lose 2, all that had to be in there. Point of no return. I had to have that at my fingertips all the time, to where we can turn around and get back, just in case.
That crew of 11 was like a family?
Yes, it was. We were very close to one another. And when you're up there and you know your life's dependent on it, your life's dependent on each other's job.